wasn't one of my best moments. I'll just get that out there right now. Get it out of the way right up front because it needs to be acknowledged. It needs to just be said. It wasn't one of my best moments. It was probably 10 years or maybe a little bit better than that. That long ago. I had been tasked with purchasing an LCD projector for the church. A projector like that. After a lot of online research into what we needed and what was out there and who had the best prices, I finally picked out the projector that I thought we wanted. And I found a chain store, an electronics chain store that had just the model. And it was on sale. So everything was just gelling together. It was obviously the right time. So I went in and I talked to the sales clerk about this particular model and I verified a couple of things, a couple of questions that I had, and then I told him I'd take it. He was happy. It was a good sale. It was like $800 or $900 at the time. So we went to the checkout, and there I produced my tax-exempt letter. Now, if you've ever bought anything for the church or for a school, you know that the tax-exempt letter is a letter that we have that says we're a tax-exempt organization, so we don't pay sales tax. So I presented that letter to the cashier, knowing that sales tax on $800 or $900 was going to be considerable and it would save a lot of money. So the cashier took this letter and she read it. And she seemed to be having some trouble with it, so she handed it to the clerk, who was there too. The clerk had brought the projector up. And he read it and he kind of looked at her and then he took the letter and he took it over to somebody else to read. And then out of the corner of my eye, I could see that person that he'd taken to got on the phone. He apparently read the letter to whoever was at the other end. And I began to wonder what language this letter had been written in. I thought, well, maybe I should have checked it first or something. But after about 10 or 15 minutes, it seemed a lot longer, standing there in line, the chain was reversed. And the guy who had been on the phone handed it to the guy who had given it to him, who handed it to the clerk, who handed it to the cashier, and each time they said something to one another. And then the clerk, or the cashier, handed the letter back to me and said, "We can't use this." I said, "Why?" And she explained, "Well, this letter is from Wisconsin. We're in Illinois, and we can't accept a tax-exempt letter from Wisconsin." And I stood there just kind of blinking for a moment or two, not understanding, and then I repeated back what I thought she had said, just to make sure that I understood. And then I tried to reason with her. I said, "You know, we're just across the border. We are probably a lot closer than many of your Illinois clients are, so this has to happen all the time, so why can't you accept our letter?" And she just kind of shrugged and said sorry, she couldn't do it. And then the clerk explained the same, the clerk also explained, thinking perhaps that coming from somebody else it would be clearer. But as this was going on, I was getting angrier and angrier, and even though I kept my anger under control, except probably for the tone in my voice and the strangling motions I was making with my hands, I'm sure you could tell. When they finally told me, "Well, go ahead, pay the taxes on the purchase, and then you can come in a week or so and talk to the district manager when he comes in," I finally wanted to have the projector. I said, "Fine, we'll just do that." Paid, took the projector, walked out to the car, stormed out to the car. And it wasn't until I actually got in the car that I let my anger boil over, and then I did the only thing I could do. I called my wife. And I just ranted to her for 5 or 10 minutes about my experience and about what lousy customer service the store had and about how much I hated those people in their store and their families and their little dogs too. And she let me go on like that until I started to wind down, and then when she had a moment, she just said very calmly, "You know, you're not being very Christianly right now." And of course I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, when somebody wrongs us, we're not supposed to get angry at them. And her voice of calm, sweet reason brought me to a full stop for about 5 seconds. And then I explained, I'm not mad at them because they did something wrong. I'm mad at them because they're idiots. And in retrospect, that's probably not a valid theological argument. Now Jesus wouldn't have thought so. I'm pretty sure that if Jesus happened to be listening into that particular conversation, he was probably rolling his eyes and doing one of these before I ever finished. Because Jesus couldn't have made it much plainer than he did in today's reading from Matthew, that if you're angry with a brother or a sister, you will be subject to judgment. Call your neighbor a fool. The Aramaic word they use in some translations is raka. It just sounds worse. Do that and you're subject to the fires of hell, and it just goes on. And the gist of what Jesus is preaching in this section of the Sermon on the Mount is that it's not just what you do. It's what you think. It's not just what you do. It's how you feel in here. You can be all Eddie Haskell on the outside, and you're all polite and saccharine to the outside world, but on the inside, if you're something less than that, judgment's going to be rendered on what's on the inside. That is a revolutionary message. Now, this was Jesus coming down to this world to preach and teach and to lead us, and he took things in a whole new direction. And he didn't set the law aside, he just took the law and he took it even further. Jewish law at the time was very closely defined. It was a system of sins and expectations, and it controlled what you did, and it told what you had to do in case you did something against the law or outside of the law. And almost every aspect of everyday life was governed at some level by the words from the law. This was a law handed down from Moses, through Moses. And observant Jews tried to live by the letter of the law, the words of the law. And like any society, some people just didn't care. But the revolutionary message of Jesus Christ is that everybody fell short. Everybody's understanding of the law was flawed because the truth, the unhappy truth that Jesus laid down on them in the Sermon on the Mount, is that the law measured not what you did, but it measured your heart. Angry inside, even if you don't show it, you're still subject to the law. Lusting after somebody, even if you don't act on it, and you're still subject to the law. Idly daydreaming, perhaps, about robbing a bank or hacking into somebody's computer or draining an ATM. Beating the living daylights out of the next person that cuts in front of you in the checkout line at Walmart. You're still subject to the law. And this is a tough idea for us to wrestle with because we live in our heads. Yeah, we have lives out here in the external world where we interact with people and we go to school or we go to work, and all the things that happen out here. And this is all real and it's all very important, but we also live our internal lives as well. We live our lives in this universe inside our skull. It's where our hopes and our dreams and our fears and our fantasies reside. And we like to think that up here it's private. We can put up a no trespassing sign and do whatever we want to in here, and there's no consequence. It's nobody else's business. What happens in your head stays in your head. Those of you old enough to remember Jimmy Carter as a presidential candidate, remember that he kind of pulled the pin on that grenade and threw himself on it when he talked in an interview in Playboy about lusting after women in his own heart. And he was mocked mercilessly for it. And the truth, it wasn't anything that Jesus hadn't already said 2,000 years before. Just wasn't something people talked about, though. And if we didn't talk about it, And we could pretend it was okay. After all, everybody's human, so this goes on. We're raised to think that there is a division between what we think and what we do. As long as we keep them to ourselves, it's okay to think all sorts of things. Nobody can tell us we're wrong to think about something as long as we don't do it. So Jesus says, no, not so fast. By extending our understanding of the law to our thoughts, to our hearts, and to our emotions, we now find that the law becomes not a measure of what we can and can't do or what we should and should not do. It's a measure that tells us who we are. It tells us what we are. I don't know about you, it tells me I'm a sinner. It tells most of us that we're sinners. A person who lives fully under the law, who lived a life in harmony with God's will, wouldn't be a person who showed restraint. It wouldn't be somebody, for instance, who keeps their anger in check even when they're antagonized, or who keeps their lust in check even when they're tempted. It would be somebody whose experience of God's love was such that they didn't have those feelings at all. They would be filled up by the love of God. They would be filled up by the love of their fellow man. So that they wouldn't have these feelings. They wouldn't have to control their anger because they wouldn't get angry. They wouldn't have to rise above their desires because they wouldn't have them. And that type of life, that type of world, their lives and their relationships would be founded on love and respect. And that idea seems in some ways kind of alien or bizarre maybe because it's so hard for us to imagine. It can seem like such a totally different way of life that it's hard for most of us at least to wrap our heads around it. But that's the ideal that Jesus presents. That's what Jesus wants us to know it would be like if we were living fully in God's kingdom, if we lived our lives truly in a relationship with Him. In order to do that, we have to transcend who we are. Who we are right now. We have to move from being broken pieces of God's creation to being whole again. We have to be made whole by the love of Jesus Christ and by the grace of a forgiving God. And the good news is that way is open to us. It's open to us if we will believe, if we will reach out to Jesus and admit who we are. If we admit who we are and that we can never be anything better without Him, that sets us on the path. If we admit that we're sinners and that it was us that He died for, if we can do that, then it is possible. It's possible to live into the kingdom of God. As followers of Christ, that is what we should be striving for. The purpose of the law is not to measure what we do, but to show us who we are and to point us to who we could be with Jesus' help, with Jesus' love, in Jesus' name.